The light came first not as a color, but as a thinning of the dark, a slow bleed of gray into the black ink of the Wyoming night. It was a light without promise, a stark and honest thing that revealed the land for what it was: immense, indifferent, and thirsty. Dust, fine as ground meal, coated every surface. A second skin on the raw timber of the settlement shacks and the cracked leather of a forgotten harness. The wind, which had howled like a mourner for hours, had died, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt like a weight on the ears. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, waiting for the sun's inevitable judgment. Inside one of the cabins, where the smell of stale whiskey and restless sleep hung heavy in the air, a figure was already moving. Clara Byrne eased herself from the thin straw mattress, her bare feet finding the cold, rough-hewn floorboards without a sound. She was a slip of a thing, a woman who seemed made of taut wire and stubbornness, her youth veiled by a weariness that had settled deep in her bones. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was plaited in a thick braid that fell over her shoulder, a single defiant touch of softness in a world of splinters and grit. In the faint light filtering through the greased paper window, she looked at her left hand. It was a swollen, angry thing, bound in a crude splint of scavenged wood and strips of what was once a flour sack. The knuckles were a bruised purple, and a dull, insistent ache pulsed from her wrist to her elbow, a constant, unwelcome companion. She flexed the fingers of her right hand, testing their strength, their sureness. It would have to be enough. She moved through the main room of the cabin, a space cluttered with the debris of other people's lives. A hulking shape snored on the larger cot, the air around him thick with the fumes of his nightly ration. This was Emmett Byrne, her stepfather, a man whose presence filled a room long before he spoke a word. In another corner, a smaller form was a lump under a thin blanket. Eloise, her stepmother, a woman of quiet, sharp-edged resentments. Clara passed them both as if they were stones in a field, obstacles to be navigated without thought or feeling. Her world, her true world, lay beyond a thick canvas curtain. She pushed it aside and stepped into the kitchen. It was little more than a lean-to built against the main cabin, with a dirt floor and gaps in the walls that let the wind and dust have their way. But in its center stood the hearth. It was made of river stones and mud, wide and deep, its blackened maw the heart of this small, hard-scrabble life. For Clara, this was not just a place to cook. It was a fortress. It was the only patch of ground in this entire territory that felt like hers. With her good right hand, she began the morning ritual. The movements were awkward, slower than they should have been. She scooped embers from the banked coals with a small shovel, her injured hand held stiffly at her side. She laid kindling splinters of dry pine she'd gathered herself onto the embers, coaxing them with a gentle breath. When the first small, hungry flames licked at the wood, a measure of the tension eased from her shoulders. Fire was a language she understood. It was honest. It took what you gave it and returned warmth and light. It did not lie or shift its moods with a drink. The fire grew, casting dancing shadows that made the small space feel alive. It glinted off the collection of iron pots and pans hanging from wooden pegs, each one scoured and cared for. These were her tools, her voice. She couldn't read or write much, not like the folk back east, but she could speak in the language of simmering stews and baking bread, a language that filled bellies and, for a few moments, quieted the gnawing emptiness of this place. Her mother had taught her that language, back in a green and gentle world across the ocean. She could still hear her voice, a soft Irish lilt explaining how to know when the dough was proven, when the jam was set. Food is a kind of prayer. Clara girl, she'd said, you're putting a piece of your own heart in it, to make someone else strong. Those memories were ghosts now, thin and fragile as smoke. But here, by the fire, they felt closer. Here, she wasn't just Emmett Byrne's stepdaughter, the silent cook for a dozen rough men. She was Mary Byrne's daughter. She was herself. The first task was coffee. Grinding the beans was a trial. She had to wedge the small hand mill between her knees, her whole body tense as she turned the crank with her right hand. A sharp, searing pain shot up her splinted arm as she jostled it, and she froze, her jaw tight, a fine sheen of sweat breaking on her brow. She did not cry out. Crying was a luxury, a release she had learned long ago not to afford herself. It changed nothing. It only spent what little strength she had left. She waited for the fire in her bones to recede to its familiar, steady burn. And then she continued, the rhythmic crunching of the beans, the only sound in the growing dawn. Next came the sourdough starter, her precious mother that she'd carried all the way from the last settlement. It bubbled in its crock, smelling sour and alive. She measured flour from a heavy burlap sack, a clumsy, one-handed affair that sent a white cloud puffing into the air. She worked the dough in a large wooden bowl, pushing and folding with the heel of her one good hand, her body rocking with the effort. It was exhausting work that demanded two strong arms, but she did not stop. The men would need bread, strong bread, to sustain them for a day of breaking their backs against the unyielding land. As she worked, she could feel the settlement waking around her, the sound of a hammer striking steel from the blacksmith's shed, the lowing of oxen being yoked, the rough voices of men, thick with morning phlegm. These sounds were the backdrop to her life. The rhythm she cooked to, they were customers, nothing more. She fed them, and in return, Emmett was paid. That was the arrangement. She did not look for friendship in their faces, nor kindness. She had learned that such things were commodities rarer than fresh water out here. Her focus was absolute, a wall she built around herself each morning. In this space, with the smell of wood smoke and rising bread filling her senses, she could almost forget. She could forget the sting of Eloise's whispered words, little poisoned darts designed to find their mark. She could forget the heavy, unpredictable weight of Emmett's temper. She could almost forget the moment a few nights ago, the flash of fury in his eyes over some imagined slight, the portions for the workers. He'd bellowed, were too generous. Her quiet defiance, her refusal to cower, had been met with a brutal, silencing answer. He had seized her wrist, his grip a vice of iron, and there had been a sound, a sickening crack that had echoed louder than his shout. She pushed the memory away, kneading it into the dough under her hand. Pain was a fact of life, like the dust and the wind. You endured it. You worked through it. You did not let it break you. He had broken her hand. Yes, the bones would mend, but he would not break the part of her that lived and breathed in front of this fire. He would not take this last sanctuary from her. She shaped the loaves, her movements economical and precise despite the handicap. She slid them into the cast-iron Dutch oven, burying it in the hot coals at the edge of the hearth. Soon, the smell of baking bread joined the aroma of coffee, a scent of civilization, of comfort, in the vast, wild emptiness. It was a smell that made men think of home, even if home was a place they'd never see again. Clara Byron stood and stretched her back, the firelight catching the faint dusting of flour on her cheek and the deep, old sorrow in her eyes. The sun was now cresting the distant, jagged hills, flooding the barren landscape with a harsh, golden light. The day had begun. The men would be hungry. And with a broken hand, in the quiet fortress of her kitchen, she would cook. She would keep cooking. It was all she had left to do. The cabin groaned as Emmett Byron shifted his bulk on the cot. The sound was like that of a stressed timber, a prelude to collapse. He woke as he lived with a sense of grievance against the world. He was a large man, gone to seed. Muscle had softened into suet, and his face, framed by a grizzled, untrimmed beard, was a permanent scowl. The small kindnesses of life had long ago been burned out of him by whiskey and a deep, festering resentment that the world had not laid its riches at his feet. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the cot, and the floorboards protested. His eyes, small and bloodshot, scanned the room. settling on the canvas curtain that separated him from the kitchen. "Coffee," he rasped. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, an expectation that the world would bend to his needs. From the other cot, Eloise stirred. She was a woman who had once been pretty, but life with Emmett had chipped away at her, leaving something sharp and brittle. She watched him through narrowed eyes, her mind always working, always calculating. She was a creature of quiet influence, a whisperer of poison in her husband's ear. Her power did not lie in strength, but in her cunning ability to nurture the worst parts of the man she had married. "The girl's been up for an hour," she said, her voice a thin, reedy thing. She pulled her blanket tighter, as if to ward off the morning chill, but her gaze was fixed on the curtain. "Don't know how she manages, with that hand of hers." There was a faint note of feigned sympathy in her tone, but beneath it, a current of satisfaction ran deep and cold. She was jealous of Clara, jealous of the one thing the girl possessed that she did not, a skill. Men respected Clara's cooking. They might not speak of it, but their clean plates and their grudging silence were a form of praise. They paid Emmett for the meals, but it was Clara they depended on. This simple fact was a constant irritant to Eloise, a splinter under her skin. She had no such value. She was simply Emmett's wife, a position that felt more like a possession every day. Clara emerged from the kitchen, her splinted hand held carefully against her body. She carried a tin plate with 2 thick slices of freshly baked sourdough and a slab of salted pork fat. She placed it on the crude table in the center of the room without a word. Then she returned to the kitchen and came back with a steaming mug of black coffee. She set it beside the plate. Her face was a mask of neutrality, her eyes focused on her task, giving nothing away. Emmett grunted and fell upon the food, eating with a noisy, animalistic hunger. He tore at the bread and stuffed the pork into his mouth, chewing with his mouth open. Clara did not watch him. She turned to go back to her hearth, her sanctuary. "You're stingy with the salt pork," he said through a full mouth, a piece of bread falling from his lips onto his beard. Clara stopped but did not turn. "It's the ration for the week. Emmett." "I'm the one who says what the ration is," he shot back, his voice rising. "This is my house, my food. You're just the cook." Eloise watched the exchange, a small, tight smile playing on her lips before vanishing. "She's just being careful. Emmett, frugal. It's a good quality in a woman." Every word was a carefully placed stone, building a wall of resentment between the man and his stepdaughter. Clara said nothing more. She retreated behind the canvas curtain. Arguing was pointless. It was like reasoning with a thunderstorm. You could only wait for it to pass, and hope it didn't strike you. The memory of the last storm was still fresh, the pain in her hand a constant reminder. It had been 3 nights ago. The day had been long and hot, and the men who worked the small mining claim nearby had come back to the settlement exhausted and covered in dust. Clara had made a rich beef stew, thick with potatoes and the last of the wild onions she had found by the creek bed. She had served them generous portions, ladling the stew over thick slices of her bread. She believed a man who did a full day's work deserved a full plate of food. It was a simple, unshakable creed she had inherited from her mother. Emmett had been drinking heavily, his mood growing fouler as the evening wore on. He watched from the corner as Clara served the men. His eyes narrowed. Eloise sat beside him, occasionally murmuring something too low for Clara to hear, but she could feel the weight of their combined disapproval like a physical pressure. After the men had eaten and drifted away to their own shacks, the tension in the cabin thickened. Emmett slammed his empty whiskey bottle on the table. "You think I'm running a charity," he'd roared, his voice filling the small space. Clara was wiping down the table with a damp rag, her back to him. She didn't flinch. The men were hungry. "The men pay for a meal, not a feast," he snarled, pushing himself to his feet. He was unsteady, swaying slightly. "That's my beef, my potatoes. You're giving away my profits. Girl." "She has a soft heart," Emmett, Eloise had chimed in, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She doesn't understand business. Clara turned then, her expression calm, though her heart was pounding against her ribs. She looked directly at him, her gaze unwavering. They can't work if they're weak. What they earn for you depends on the strength I put in them. It was the simple, unvarnished truth, and for that reason, it was the most defiant thing she could have said. It was an assertion of her own value, her own role in this enterprise, and it was a direct challenge to his absolute authority. His face, already flushed with drink, darkened to a dangerous purple. He saw her quiet strength not as a virtue, but as insolence. "You think you're so clever," he'd spat, taking a step toward her. The smell of whiskey washed over her, sour and overpowering. "You think this kitchen gives you some kind of power here. You have nothing. You are nothing but what I allow you to be." She did not back away. She held her ground, her chin slightly lifted. She had learned long ago that showing fear to a man like Emmett was like showing blood to a wolf. It only made him more eager for the attack. Her silence was her only shield. But her defiance, her refusal to be cowed, was more than he could bear. His rage, stoked by whiskey and Eloise's quiet provocations, needed a release. He lunged forward. It was not a slap or a punch. It was something more deliberate, more symbolic. He wasn't just trying to hurt her. He was trying to break the source of her small, defiant independence. His big, calloused hand shot out and clamped around her left wrist. His grip was crushing, the strength in his hand born of a life of brute force. She tried to pull back, but he was too strong. "This," he growled, his face inches from hers, "is what makes you so proud. Isn't it your clever hands?" And then he twisted. There was a sound, a horrid, dull snap, like a thick branch breaking under a heavy boot. It wasn't loud, but in the sudden silence of the cabin, it seemed to echo off the walls. A bolt of white-hot, sickening pain shot up Clara's arm, so intense it stole her breath and made the room swim before her eyes. She did not scream. A strangled gasp escaped her lips, but she bit it back, her teeth clamping down on her tongue until she tasted blood. She would not give him the satisfaction of her cries. She would not beg. He released her, shoving her away. She stumbled back, cradling her injured arm, her face pale as bleached bone. She stared at her hand, which already felt alien and distant, a broken thing that no longer belonged to her. Then she lifted her eyes and looked at him. There was no hatred in her gaze. There was no fear. There was only a vast, cold emptiness that seemed to swallow the fury he had thrown at her. He had expected tears, pleas, a collapse. He had expected her to break, but she just stood there, silent and unbroken in spirit, and her silence unnerved him more than any scream could have. It was as if she had retreated to a place deep inside herself where he could not reach her, could not touch her. He had inflicted pain, but he had failed to conquer her. He grunted, a sound of frustration, and turned away. Grabbing another bottle from the shelf, he had won the physical confrontation, but he knew, on some level he could not articulate, that he had lost something more important. Eloise, after a moment's pause, rushed to Clara's side. "Oh, you poor thing," she'd cooed, reaching for the injured hand. "Let me see. Emmett, you brute! Look what you've done!" Clara pulled her arm away from Eloise's touch as if from a hot iron. She looked at her stepmother, and for a fleeting second, the emptiness in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of pure, undiluted contempt. She knew. She knew that Eloise's soft words had been the kindling for Emmett's fire. Then, turning her back on both of them, Clara walked slowly, deliberately, to the water bucket. With her good right hand, she ladled some water into a basin. She began to wash the dishes from the evening meal, her movements stiff and awkward. The clink of tin on tin was the only sound. She did not weep. She did not complain. With a broken hand, in a world of casual brutality, she simply continued to work. She would not be stopped. Now, back in the present morning, the memory faded, but the ache in her bones remained. She moved about her kitchen, preparing the large pot of oatmeal for the workers, stirring it with a long wooden spoon held in her right hand. The weight of the spoon was a strain, but she ignored it. The pain was a companion, a part of her now. She had accepted it, just as she had accepted the dust, the wind, and the cold silence of the people she lived with. She endured. It was what she knew how to do. It was a week after the morning Emmett had reasserted his dominion over the cabin, a week in which Clara's world had been circumscribed by the four walls of her kitchen and the throbbing ache in her splinted hand. The rhythm of the settlement was one of monotonous, grinding labor. Then, one afternoon, that rhythm was broken. It began as a low rumble on the edge of hearing, a vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the unmistakable thunder of a score of horses moving at a steady canter. Men stopped their work, looking to the east, their hands shielding their eyes against the relentless sun. Dust, a great yellow-brown plume, rose against the brilliant, empty blue of the sky. This was not a lone rider or a small patrol. This was an arrival. Emmett came out of the cabin, wiping grease from his mouth with the back of his hand. His usual sullen expression was replaced by one of sharp, avaricious interest. Eloise followed, hovering in the doorway like a moth drawn to a flame, her eyes narrowed and assessing. The riders came over the low rise, and the settlement seemed to shrink in their presence. They were cowboys, 24 of them, moving with the easy, rolling gait of men who spent more of their lives in the saddle than on their own 2 feet. They were here for the summer haying, a seasonal migration that brought crews of men to the vast, uncut meadows that lay in the shadow of the mountains. They were a river of temporary prosperity. And Emmett's settlement was a toll bridge. They were a rough-hewn bunch, their faces burned by the sun and wind, their clothes practical and worn. But they moved with a discipline that spoke of a firm hand guiding them. They fanned out, dismounting, tending to their horses with a practiced efficiency that was a world away from the sullen, resentful labor of the miners Emmett oversaw. Leading them, though he rode in their midst rather than at their head, was a man who seemed to have been carved from the land itself. He was a giant, not just in height, which was considerable, but in the sheer breadth of his shoulders and the solid, rooted way he sat his horse, a powerful gray gelding that looked almost delicate beneath him. His back was ramrod straight, the posture of a man who had never learned to slouch or bend. He wore plain, durable clothes, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and a beard, thick and shot through with gray, that covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that set him apart. As he dismounted, his movement slow and deliberate, he surveyed the camp, and his gaze was one of profound, unhurried calm. There was no arrogance in it, no challenge. It was the look of a man who understood the world in its fundamental terms: land, water, sky, and the work that had to be done between them. This was Boaz McCall, the owner of the sprawling J.M. Ranch, a spread that covered half the valley on the other side of the hills. His name was spoken with a kind of grudging respect even in the meanest saloons, for he was known to be hard, but impeccably fair. He was a man who built things, while men like Emmett Barn merely leached off the efforts of others. Clara heard the commotion from her kitchen. The influx of so many men meant work. She felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. More mouths to feed meant more lifting, more stirring, more of the one-handed, awkward labor that sent jolts of fire up her arm. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of roasting venison, and reinforced the walls of her fortitude. They were just men. They needed to eat. Her job was to feed them. It was as simple as that. Emmett greeted Boaz McCall with a loud, booming heartiness that was entirely false. "McCall, a sight for sore eyes, welcome. Welcome, my humble establishment is at your service." Boaz's nod was curt, his eyes taking in Emmett's soft hands and the whiskey flush on his cheeks. "Burn," he said, his voice a low baritone, as steady and deep as the land he owned. "My men are hungry. We'll be taking our meals here for the duration." Of course, the best in the territory. "I guarantee it," Emmett boasted, clapping his hands together. Clara began to bring the food out, her face set in a neutral mask. She moved with a purpose that bordered on invisibility, her eyes fixed on the table, the platters, the empty tin plates. She carried a large trencher of roasted venison, its weight a challenge for her single good arm. She placed it in the center of the long trestle table, then returned for the bread, the beans, the pot of scalding coffee. The cowboys filled the benches, their talk loud and full of the easy camaraderie of shared hardship. They were loud but not threatening, their energy a stark contrast to the simmering violence she was used to. Still, she kept her head down, her world reduced to the path between her hearth and their table. She felt their eyes on her. Of course, a woman, particularly a young one, was a curiosity in a place like this. She was used to the looks, some curious, some hungry, some merely dismissive. She had learned to wear them like a cloak, to let them slide off her without touching the person underneath. She moved along the bench, pouring coffee, her injured hand held close to her body, the splint partially hidden by the folds of her apron, but it was impossible to hide completely. The awkwardness of her movements, the way she had to brace the heavy coffee pot against her hip to pour with her right hand, was obvious to anyone who cared to look. Boaz McCall sat at the head of the table, eating with the same deliberate economy of motion he did everything else. He did not engage in the loud banter of his men, but his presence was enough to keep it from tipping over into true rowdiness. And he watched. He missed nothing. He saw Emmett's fawning posture and Eloise's serpent-like stillness in the doorway. He saw the quality of the food simple, honest, well prepared, and he saw the woman who served it. His first glance was cursory, taking her in as part of the scenery, young, worn. Then he looked again. He noticed the way she moved, a pained stiffness she tried to conceal with efficiency. He saw the splint, a flicker of something not pity, but a kind of analytical curiosity passed through his calm eyes. Pity was a useless emotion. It softened a man. And out here, softness was a death sentence. What he felt was a question. He watched her as she made her way down the length of the table. He saw the tremor in her right arm as she held the coffee pot for the 10th time, her muscles straining with the unaccustomed, singular burden. He saw the faint sheen of sweat on her temples, and the way her jaw was set, a small, hard line of determination in her pale face. He saw that she never, not once, met anyone's gaze. Her eyes were always down, focused on the task at hand. But this was not the downcast gaze of a servant cowed by her master. Boaz had seen that look 1,000 times. This was different. This was a deliberate withdrawal, a conscious act of self-preservation. It was the silence of a fortress under siege, its gates barred, its defenders refusing to acknowledge the enemy outside. It was a silence that spoke volumes. It spoke of a pain deeper than a broken bone. It spoke of endurance. One of his younger hands, a boy named Billy, tried to catch her eye. "Mighty fine cookin', ma'am," he said, his voice earnest and friendly. Clara merely nodded, a barely perceptible dip of her chin. As she moved on to the next man, she did not smile or offer a word of thanks. It was not rudeness. It was a wall, thick and high. Boaz took it all in. He pieced together the story without needing the words. The blustering, whiskey-soaked man who claimed ownership, the watchful, silent wife who stood in the shadows, and this girl, this woman with the broken hand and the unbroken will, who moved through their world like a ghost, her only reality the fire and the food. He saw the dynamic clearly, a small, petty kingdom built on a foundation of fear and control. He found his eyes drawn back to her splinted hand. He imagined the force it would take to break the bones in a person's wrist. It was not the kind of injury one got from a fall or from working with livestock. It was a specific kind of injury, a personal one. As she passed him to refill the bread basket, she felt the weight of his gaze. It was different from the others. It wasn't invasive or demanding. It was heavy, steady, and thoughtful. For a terrifying second, she felt seen. Not just her body or her function as a cook, but the person inside, the person she worked so hard to hide. The feeling was so alien it was almost painful. Her instinct was to flinch, to pull back even further into herself. She kept her head bowed, her braid falling forward to hide her face, and moved away as quickly as she could, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Bo." As McCall said nothing. He finished his meal in his customary silence, took a long drink of the strong, black coffee, and watched her retreat back behind the canvas curtain into the flickering, fire-lit world of her kitchen. He did not feel pity for her. He felt a profound and surprising sense of respect in a land that broke people as a matter of course, that ground them down into dust and despair. The silent woman with the haunted eyes was, in her own quiet way, refusing to be broken. And Boaz McCall, a man who had built his life on the principle of unyielding strength, recognized it for what it was. The days settled into a new rhythm, one dictated by the appetites of 24 hungry cowboys. Clara's life, already a cycle of endless work, intensified. She rose before the first hint of dawn and often didn't bank the fire until the moon was high and cold in the sky. Her world was a blur of flour, fat, and fire. Her good hand a constant flurry of motion while her left remained a useless, aching weight at her side. The cowboys, for their part, were a loud but mostly harmless presence. They treated her with a kind of rough, impersonal respect born of full bellies. They were grateful for the hot meals that punctuated their grueling days of haying under the brutal Wyoming sun. They learned not to expect conversation from the silent cook, accepting her quiet efficiency as just another feature of this harsh landscape. One morning, while taking inventory of her meager supplies, Clara found a small, nearly forgotten crate tucked away in the coolest corner of the lean-to. Inside, nestled in dry straw, were a half-dozen apples. They were last season's, wrinkled and soft. But to Clara, they were a treasure beyond price. They were the last remnant of a traveling peddler who had passed through months ago. A small extravagance she had purchased with a few cents she had managed to keep for herself. She had been saving them for a day when the monotony became too much to bear. A secret promise of a single, sweet taste of a world left behind. Today, she decided, was that day. She would make an apple pie. The thought itself was an act of rebellion. A pie was not a necessity like bread or beans. It was a grace note, a luxury. It required time and care. Two things in short supply. More than that. It required a deftness that was nearly impossible with one hand. But the idea took root in her, a stubborn weed of defiance. She would do it, not for the men, and certainly not for Emmett, but for herself. It would be a quiet declaration that even here, in this place of dust and deprivation, something beautiful could be made. Eloise watched from the doorway as Clara began the painstaking process. "Apples," she said, her voice thin and sharp. "That's a bit fancy for a midday meal, isn't it? Emmett won't like you wasting supplies on frills." Clara did not look up. She was focused on the difficult task of peeling an apple with one hand, holding the fruit steady against the rough wood of the table and drawing the knife carefully toward her. "There is enough," she said, her voice low and even. The work was maddeningly slow. Each apple was a small battle. She had to core them with the tip of her knife, her fingers aching with the strain of holding the fruit steady. The crust was an even greater challenge. She worked the lard into the flour with the fingers of her right hand, her movements clumsy, her shoulders screaming in protest. A proper pastry crust needed two hands, a light, quick touch. Hers was a heavy, labored effort. More than once. She was tempted to give up, to throw the sticky, uncooperative dough into the slop bucket. But the memory of her mother's hands, floured and nimble, kept her going. She could almost smell the scent of cinnamon and baking apples from their small cottage kitchen in Ireland. A world away. A pie, her mother had always said, was not just food. It was a welcome. It was a way of making a house into a home. This cabin was not a home, but for a few hours, Clara could pretend she could fill it with the scent of one. By the time the midday bell rang, the pie was resting on the hearth, its crust a beautiful, imperfect gold, the juices bubbling thick and sweet from the vents she had carved in the top. The entire lean-to was filled with a warm, cinnamon-scented cloud that was so at odds with the smell of dust and sweat outside that it felt like a kind of magic. The cowboys came in, tired and sun-beaten, and their loud talk faltered as the aroma hit them. They sniffed the air like hungry hounds, their eyes wide with disbelief. "Lord have mercy," one of them breathed. "Is that apple pie?" Clara served the main meal of salt pork and beans, her face betraying nothing of the morning's struggle or the small, fierce pride she felt. The men ate quickly, their eyes constantly straying to the pie on the hearth. When she finally brought it to the table, a reverent silence fell. She cut into it, the crust giving way with a satisfying crunch, and served each man a slice on his tin plate. The reaction was immediate and profound. Grunts of pleasure, sighs of pure, unadulterated bliss. For these men, a taste of apple pie was a taste of a life they had all left behind, of mothers and sweethearts, of green fields and cool autumns. It was a potent reminder of a softer world. Boaz McCall ate his slice slowly, his expression thoughtful. He watched Clara as she moved back to the relative anonymity of her kitchen space, her shoulders tight with the effort of remaining invisible. The other men were loud in their praise, calling out their thanks. Clara ignored them, her focus entirely on her pots and pans. As the men began to file out, ready for the afternoon's work, Boaz rose from the table. He was the last to leave. He walked not to the main door, but to the canvas curtain of the kitchen. Clara heard his heavy, deliberate footsteps and tensed, her back to him. He stopped just outside the curtain. "Ma'am," he said, his deep voice quiet but resonant. Clara froze. She did not turn. "This pie," he continued, his voice devoid of any flirtation or false sentiment. "It makes a man forget the desert for a spell." It was a simple statement, delivered with a plain, unadorned honesty. But to Clara, it was like a key turning in a lock she had forgotten existed. He wasn't complimenting her. He was acknowledging her work, the effect of her labor. He saw not just the food, but the meaning behind it. He understood that she had offered them not just a meal, but a memory, a moment of reprieve. For the first time in a very long time, she felt seen not as a drudge or a possession, but as a maker, a creator. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. She turned slowly, her head still bowed, and risked a glance up at him from under her lashes. She saw his eyes, calm and clear as a winter sky, and there was no pity in them. There was only a quiet, steady regard. It was the look of one capable person acknowledging another. The moment stretched, a fragile thread of connection in the noisy, brutal world. Then she looked away, her heart hammering, and gave a small, jerky nod. Boaz held out a cloth sack, heavy and bulging. "This is from my own grist mill," he said, "the finest flour, from the other side of the mountains. A man who appreciates good baking knows the value of good flour." He placed the sack on a nearby crate, just inside the kitchen space. It was a gift, but it felt like a trade, a respectful exchange. He had received her gift of the pie, and now he was returning it in kind. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, the words so soft they were barely audible. He gave a single formal nod, then turned and was gone. Clara stared at the sack of flour as if it were a bag of gold. Fine flour. She hadn't felt the soft, powdery texture of fine milled flour in years. Her fingers itched to open it. It was a treasure, a validation. Her reverie was shattered by Emmett's voice, thick with suspicion and rage. He had been watching from the main room. His eyes narrowed. "What was that all about?" he demanded, stomping into the kitchen. His presence seemed to suck the warmth and the sweet smell from the air, leaving only a sour resentment. He jabbed a thick finger toward the flour sack. "What did he give you?" "Flour," Clara said, her voice regaining its usual flat, guarded tone. "Flour," he sneered. "A man like Boaz McCall doesn't just give away flour. What did you do to earn it? What promises did you make him with your little pie?" Eloise appeared behind him, her face a mask of concern. "Now, Emmett," she said smoothly, "I'm sure the girl meant no harm. She was just being hospitable." The word was a subtle poison, implying a kind of intimacy that made Clara's skin crawl. Emmett's face was dark with a possessive, jealous fury. It was not about the flour. It was about the respect Boaz had shown Clara. He had treated her as an individual, a person worthy of a direct transaction, bypassing Emmett entirely. In Emmett's world, this was an unforgivable transgression. It was a challenge to his ownership. "He thinks he can just come in here and deal with my cook," Emmett roared, his voice bouncing off the stone hearth. "He thinks he can win her over with a sack of flour. You belong to this house to me." He reached for the sack, his intention clear. He would confiscate it, absorb this small kindness into his own store of goods, erasing the moment of connection it represented. Something inside Clara, something that had been dormant for a very long time, shifted. It was not a surge of courage, not yet. It was a tremor of profound injustice. The pie had been hers. The compliment had been hers. The gift had been given to her. She did not move to stop him. She knew that would be futile and foolish. She did not speak, but as his hand closed over the top of the sack, her eyes met his. And for the first time, her gaze did not hold the flat, empty endurance of a survivor. It did not hold fear. For a fleeting, powerful instant, it held the flickering flame of a question. It was a look that asked, "Is this all? Is this right?" It was a look that judged him. Her eyes wavered, not from weakness, but from the strain of holding this new, fragile, and dangerous emotion. Emmett saw it, and it startled him. He hesitated, his hand still on the sack. He had expected her to cower, to retreat into her usual silent compliance, this flicker of a soul, of a self that was not entirely his to command, was something new. He grunted, snatching the sack away and throwing it into the corner with the other supplies. "Don't you get any ideas, girl?" he snarled, trying to regain his footing. "You ain't nothing special." He stormed out of the kitchen. Eloise gave Clara a final, triumphant little smile before following him. Clara was left alone with the lingering scent of apples and cinnamon. Her hand throbbed. Her heart ached with a feeling she couldn't name. But as she stood there, staring at the sack of fine flour in the corner, she knew that something had irrevocably changed. A small, respectful kindness had found a crack in the wall she had built around herself. And through that crack, a dangerous and unfamiliar light was beginning to shine in. The sack of fine flour sat in the corner of the kitchen, a silent testament to a moment of unexpected grace. For 2 days, Clara did not touch it. She looked at it, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and suspicion. Kindness, in her experience, was a currency. It was offered in exchange for something, a down payment on a future debt. She did not know what Boaz McCall wanted, but she knew a man like that, a man who owned land and commanded the loyalty of others, did not act without reason. She feared the reason, feared the inevitable moment when the bill would come due. Her life continued in its harsh, predictable rhythm. She cooked for the men. She endured Emmett's sullen glares and Eloise's saccharine, venomous whispers. The pain in her hand had subsided into a constant, dull throb, a physical echo of the emotional ache she lived with every day. She had retreated back into her shell, the brief connection she had felt with Boaz McCall seeming like a dream, a trick of the light.
Then, 3 days after the incident with the pie, he returned.
He did not ride in with his crew. He came alone, his big gray gelding moving at a steady, unhurried walk. He timed his arrival for late afternoon, when the day's heat was beginning to break and the haying crew was on its final run. His official business was a brief consultation with his foreman, a grizzled man named Jed. Clara saw him from the kitchen, her heart giving a painful lurch in her chest. She immediately turned her back, busying herself with scrubbing a large iron pot, her knuckles white on the handle. She heard their voices, Boaz's low baritone and Jed's rougher tones, discussing logistics, water levels, and the curing of the hay. She tried to block them out, to focus on the circular, scraping motion of her brush against the pot, but she was acutely aware of him, of his presence just beyond her canvas curtain. After a few minutes, Jed's footsteps receded, but Boaz's did not. She heard them, slow and heavy, approaching her kitchen. She held her breath, her shoulders rigid. This was it. This was the moment of reckoning, the collection of the debt. His shadow fell across the threshold of the lean-to, but he did not enter. He stopped just short of the dirt floor that marked her domain, his large frame filling the opening. He stood on the dusty ground outside, respecting the invisible line as if it were a solid wall. The gesture was so profound, so at odds with the casual, invasive way Emmett treated her space, that it momentarily disarmed her. "Ma'am," he said. She did not turn around. "Sir," she replied, her voice tight and low. "My men speak highly of your cooking," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Good food keeps the work steady." He paused. "I noticed your stores might be running low on some essentials." She still did not turn. She was a coiled spring of tension. "A good cook can always use good rendered lard," he stated, as if discussing the weather. He bent down and placed a heavy, cloth-wrapped parcel on the same crate where he had left the flour. "From our own hogs. It fries clean." And that was all. He did not ask about her hand. He did not ask if she needed help. He did not pry or linger. He had stated his business, delivered his offering, and with a quiet, "Good day, ma'am," he was gone. His footsteps faded, followed by the soft whicker of his horse and the rhythmic hoofbeats of its departure. Clara stood frozen for a full minute, listening until the sound was completely swallowed by the vast silence of the plains. Slowly, she turned. The parcel sat on the crate, a solid, tangible object in the fading light. She approached it cautiously, as if it might be a trap. She unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a large block of pure white, clean-smelling lard, a cook's treasure. It was a practical, thoughtful, and entirely impersonal gift. It was an offering from one professional to another. She touched it with her fingertips. It was cool and firm. A wave of confusion washed over her, so potent it made her feel dizzy. This was not the behavior of a man who wanted something from her. This was the behavior of a man who simply saw her. He saw her work, he understood its needs, and he had, without fanfare, provided there were no strings attached. The idea was so foreign, so radical, that she had no framework to understand it. The visits became a pattern. Twice a week, Boaz McCall would ride over from the haying camp, always under the guise of speaking with his foreman, and each time he would stop at the edge of her kitchen. He never crossed the threshold. He would stand there, his hat in his hands, and offer some small, practical item. Once it was a bundle of dried herbs, thyme, and sage wrapped in twine. "A friend of my late wife used to grow these," he'd explained, his voice softening almost imperceptibly at the mention of his wife. "Said they give a soul to a simple roast." Another time, it was a brand new whetstone. "A cook's best friend is a sharp knife." he'd said simply. His most surprising gift came a week later. He presented her with a small, heavy bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were 3 antique baking molds made of heavy tin, shaped like a heart, a star, and a crescent moon. They were old, bearing the dings and scratches of a long life of use, but they were clean and beautiful. "Found these in an old trunk in my barn," he said, his eyes on the horizon. "They belonged to my mother. It seems a shame for them to gather dust. A tool should be used." Clara stared at them, speechless. These were not mere supplies. These were personal. They had a history, a story. They were a gift of trust. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she held his gaze for more than a fleeting second. She saw the deep lines etched around his calm eyes, lines of work and weather, but not of cruelty. She saw a profound loneliness in their depths, a quiet sorrow that seemed to recognize her own. "They are beautiful," she managed to say, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. He simply nodded, put on his hat, and rode away. These visits, as quiet and respectful as they were, did not go unnoticed. The settlement was a small, closed world, and any deviation from the norm was scrutinized and dissected. The cowboys at the evening meal started to look from Boaz to Clara with knowing grins. The miners whispered over their coffee. Tongues began to wag. McCall's taken a shine to the cook. "What's a rich man like that see in her? She's as plain as a mud fence and twice as quiet." Maybe he's just fond of her cooking. A man don't ride 5 miles twice a week for a plate of beans, no matter how good they are. The gossip was a low, buzzing insect, and its favorite place to land was in Eloise's ear. She absorbed every word, every insinuation, and saw in it a perfect opportunity. Her jealousy of Clara had been festering, and Boaz McCall's attentions were like salt in the wound. A man of his stature, of his wealth, was paying heed to the broken-handed cook, while she, Eloise, remained invisible, trapped in a loveless existence with a drunken brute. She chose her moment carefully, one evening when Emmett was deep in his cups, his mood sullen and volatile. "It's a shame, is what it is," she said, sighing dramatically as she mended one of his shirts. "What's a shame?" Emmett grunted, not looking up from his bottle. "The way people are talking," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, "about Mr. McCall and Clara." That got his attention. He lowered the bottle, his small eyes narrowing. "What are they saying?" "Oh, you know how people are," she said, feigning reluctance. "They see a powerful man like Mr. McCall, a landowner, coming here day after day. They see him bringing gifts. They don't see it as kindness. They see it as a claim." Emmett's knuckles whitened around the bottle. Eloise pressed her advantage, her voice laced with false sympathy for him. "They're saying he comes onto your land and courts your stepdaughter right under your nose. They say it makes you look, well, it makes it seem like you have no control over your own house." It was the perfect poison. She knew Emmett's pride was a fragile, brittle thing, built on a foundation of bluster and bullying. The suggestion that another man, a more powerful man, was showing him disrespect by ignoring his authority and dealing directly with a woman he considered his property was the deepest insult imaginable. "He brings her trinkets," Emmett snarled, the words slurring together, like she's some prize at a fair. "I'm sure he means no disrespect, dear," Eloise cooed, patting his arm. "But you know, Clara doesn't discourage it. She takes his gifts. She talks to him. It gives people the wrong impression." The seed was planted. Emmett did not explode. His rage was a slow, cold burn. He was too much of a coward to confront Boaz McCall directly. Boaz was a force of nature, a man of real power, while Emmett was merely a bully. So, his festering anger, his wounded pride, his bitter jealousy, all of it turned inward, and then outward, toward the only safe target he had. His behavior toward Clara changed. The casual cruelty was replaced by a watchful, menacing silence. He would sit in the corner of the main room and just stare at her while she worked in the kitchen, his eyes following her every move. The air in the cabin grew thick and heavy with unspoken threats. Clara felt the shift. She felt his eyes on her back, a physical weight of malice. She saw the triumphant, knowing glint in Eloise's eye. And she was terrified. The small, fragile hope that Boaz's visits had kindled now felt like a terrible liability. It was a light that made the shadows around her seem darker and more dangerous than ever before. Each quiet kindness he offered her was now being twisted into a weapon to be used against her. The seeds he had planted with his gentle respect were beginning to sprout, but Clara feared, with a cold certainty, that the harvest would be a violent one. The week that followed was a slow, agonizing tightening of a garrote. Emmett's simmering rage did not dissipate. It curdled. He drank more, spoke less, and watched Clara with a predatory stillness that was far more terrifying than his drunken bellowing. The air in the cabin grew so thick with unspoken violence that it felt hard to breathe. Each clink of a pot, each scrape of a knife, seemed to echo in the oppressive silence. A potential spark in a room filled with black powder. Eloise moved through this tension like a fish in water. Her element, a carefully placed sigh here, a look of feigned pity there, was all it took to keep her husband's resentment at a low boil. She was a master of the subtle wound. The poison administered in a sweet drink. The breaking point came on an evening when the sky was the color of a fresh bruise and the wind moaned around the corners of the cabin like a lost soul. The cowboys had finished their meal and returned to their camp, their loud, boisterous energy leaving a profound vacuum in its wake. Boaz McCall had not visited that day, a small mercy for which Clara had been grateful, as his presence now felt like holding a lit lantern in a hurricane. Emmett had been drinking since noon. He had not eaten a bite of the stew Clara had prepared. He sat hunched over the crude table, a nearly empty bottle of whiskey clutched in his hand, his eyes fixed on the canvas curtain that led to the kitchen. He was a storm gathering force, a dark cloud waiting for the lightning to strike. Clara was cleaning up, her movements quiet and economical. She was washing the antique baking molds Boaz had given her, handling them with a gentle care that was a stark contrast to the ugliness that filled the main room. She dried the tin heart, its surface gleaming in the firelight, and the simple, tender shape of it felt like an accusation in that hateful space. It was that simple image that broke him, the sight of her caring for a gift from another man, a symbol of a respect he could never command, was the final, unbearable insult to his fragile, liquor-soaked pride. He pushed himself to his feet, the legs of his chair scraping violently against the floorboards. The movement was sudden, explosive. He said nothing. His face was a contorted mask of pure, unthinking rage. He stormed past the canvas curtain and into her sanctuary. The first sound was the shocking, deafening crash of cast iron against stone. He had seized the heavy stew pot from its hook and hurled it against the hearth. It struck with a clang that vibrated through the floor and up Clara's bones, leaving a large, dark dent in the metal. The last of the stew splattered against the stones, hissing as it hit the hot embers. Clara froze, her hand still holding the tin heart. She watched, a spectator to the desecration of her own small world. He was a man possessed, a whirlwind of destruction. He ripped her other pots and pans from their pegs, throwing them to the dirt floor, stomping on them with his heavy boots, his face purple with exertion. He was not just breaking her tools, he was trying to break her spirit, to smash the one part of her life where she held any agency, any pride. He swept the shelves clean, sending tin plates and cups clattering. He kicked over the water bucket, a wave of cold water spreading across the dirt floor, carrying the grime and the dust with it. Eloise appeared in the doorway, her hands clasped to her mouth in a perfect pantomime of horror. "Emmett, please," she cried, her voice thin and theatrical. "You'll destroy everything." Her words were not a plea for him to stop. They were fuel. They validated his rage, framed it as a righteous, if excessive, act of a wronged man. Clara did not move. She stood by the washing basin, a silent, still point in the chaos. She watched him, her face pale, her expression unreadable. She felt strangely distant, as if she were watching a play, a brutal and ugly performance. His rampage seemed to have spent itself. He stood panting in the middle of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and bloodshot. The kitchen, her orderly, functional, safe space, was a ruin. And then his eyes fell upon it. On a high shelf, tucked away behind a sack of dried beans, was a small, worn tin box. It was a simple biscuit tin, dented and rusted at the edges, but it was the vault that held her entire past. With a guttural roar, he reached up, his big hand closing around it, and ripped it from the shelf. He shook it, a rattling, pathetic sound. Then he pried the lid open. The contents spilled onto the floor at his feet. A small, tarnished silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother, a set of mother-of-pearl buttons from her mother's wedding dress, and a small, precious bundle of papers. Folded and refolded so many times the creases were worn thin, tied with a faded ribbon. He knew what they were. He had seen her consulting them, her finger tracing the faded, spidery ink. He bent down, not to pick up the locket or the buttons, but the papers. He held them up, his lip curled in a sneer of ultimate triumph. He looked directly at Clara, his eyes burning with a hateful fire. He wanted her to witness this. He wanted to see her break. "Your mother's spells," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Her little kitchen magic. Let's see how it holds up against a real fire." Before Clara could even process the words, before she could form a plea or a cry, he turned and, with a flick of his wrist, tossed the small bundle into the heart of the fire. For a second, nothing happened. The papers lay on the glowing embers, a small, white rectangle in a bed of red. Then, a corner began to curl. A small, yellow flame licked at the edge, and in an instant, the entire bundle was engulfed. The fire consumed them with a hungry, whispering roar. The ink, her mother's handwriting, the last physical piece of her she had left in the world, flared brightly for a moment and then vanished. In less than 5 seconds, a lifetime of love and knowledge, of comfort and connection, was reduced to a few fluttering, gray-black ashes. The finality of it was absolute. Emmett stood there for a moment longer, breathing heavily. His rage was gone, leaving behind a hollow, ugly satisfaction. He had done it. He had finally reached the core of her, the place she had kept hidden and safe, and he had burned it to nothing. "Now you've got nothing to be so proud of," he mumbled, more to himself than to her. He stumbled out of the ruined kitchen, pushing past Eloise, and collapsed onto his cot, where he was snoring within minutes. Eloise cast one last look at Clara, a look of cold, reptilian victory, and then retreated to her own corner, pulling the blanket over her head. Clara was alone. The silence that descended was more profound than the noise that had preceded it. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting is over, a silence filled with ghosts and echoes. She did not move for a long time. The tin heart was still in her hands, its edges digging into her palms, slowly, as if her limbs belonged to someone else. She placed it on the edge of the washing basin. She walked into the wreckage of her kitchen. Her feet crunched on a broken piece of crockery. She didn't seem to notice. She approached the hearth. The fire was dying now, the embers glowing a dull, angry red. She sank to her knees on the dirt floor, her eyes fixed on the spot where the papers had landed. A few weightless ashes drifted up on a current of warm air and were gone. There was nothing left, nothing to save, nothing to even mourn over. She waited for the tears. She had cried for less. She had cried from loneliness, from exhaustion, from the simple, grinding misery of her life. But now, in the face of this ultimate violation, the well was dry.
There were no tears left. The grief was too deep, too absolute for such a simple release. She felt something inside her break. It was not the sharp, hot snap of a bone. It was a cold, silent shattering, like a sheet of ice cracking under an immense, invisible weight. The part of her that had learned to endure, to bend without breaking, to absorb the pain and the cruelty and still find a reason to get up in the morning, that part of her was gone. It had been incinerated along with her mother's recipes. She knelt there in the dark, surrounded by the ruins of her life. For an hour, maybe more. The fire died completely, leaving only a faint, gray warmth. The cabin grew cold. Then, slowly, with a stiffness that was not entirely physical, she pushed herself up. She stood, her face, illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the gaps in the wall, was a blank, emotionless mask. But her eyes were not the same. The haunted, weary sadness was gone. In its place was something new, something hard and still and cold. It was the stillness of a frozen lake, its depths unreadable, its surface unbreakable. The girl who had knelt in the ashes was gone. The woman who stood up was someone else entirely. She turned her back on the hearth and, in the profound and total silence, began to pick up the first broken pot. The dawn that followed the destruction was cold and gray, the light seeping into the cabin like dirty water. Clara was already awake. She had not slept. She had spent the night in the ruins of her kitchen, not cleaning, but sorting. She moved with a slow, methodical deliberation that was more chilling than any frantic grief. She separated the dented but usable pots from those that were beyond repair. She gathered the scattered tin plates, stacking them in a neat, if battered, pile. She did not weep. The part of her that could produce tears had been cauterized by the fire. When the first of the cowboys arrived for breakfast, they stopped short in the doorway. The usual morning sounds, the crackle of the fire, the sizzle of fat in a pan. The comforting aroma of coffee and baking bread were absent. There was only a profound, unnatural silence. They peered past the canvas curtain and saw the wreckage. They saw Clara moving through it like a ghost, her face a pale, expressionless mask. She had a small fire going in the hearth, just enough to boil water for coffee in a single, salvaged pot. She met their shocked gazes without a flicker of emotion. "There is coffee," she said, her voice a monotone, devoid of all inflection. "There will be no bread this morning." The men, rough and unlettered as they were, understood. They looked from the ruin to the closed door of the main cabin, where Emmett's snores could be heard, and they drew their own conclusions. They took their coffee in silence, their usual boisterous banter extinguished. They ate the cold, leftover venison and beans from the night before without complaint. Something ugly had happened here, something that went beyond a simple drunken temper. A line had been crossed, and the quiet respect they held for the cook curdled into a cold contempt for the man who had done this to her. News travels in the West on currents of dust and whispers. The cowboys, working the hayfields, talked. They told their foreman, Jed, what they had seen. Jed, a man as weathered and practical as an old saddle, listened with a grim set to his jaw. He had seen the way Boaz McCall watched the cook, the quiet, respectful way he brought her small gifts. He knew his boss was not a man to meddle in another's affairs, but he also knew that Boaz had a long memory for injustice. That afternoon, a circuit merchant, a man named Silas who traveled between the larger towns and the outlying settlements, arrived in his rickety wagon. He was a purveyor of goods, but his real stock in trade was information and credit. Jed had a quiet word with him, and later, Silas sought out Emmett Byrne. Their conversation was short, held behind the closed door of the cabin, but when Silas emerged, his face was tight with professional satisfaction. When Emmett came out later, his face was ashen. The whispers that had started in the hayfields now found solid ground. Silas, greasing a wagon wheel, spoke casually to one of the miners. Emmett Byrne, it turned out, was living on a mountain of debt. The land his settlement was on wasn't truly his. It was leased on credit from a land speculator in Cheyenne. The supplies he sold at an exorbitant markup, the whiskey, the flour, the salted pork were all bought on a note of promise from suppliers like Silas. Emmett was a king in a kingdom of paper, and his reign was built on bluff and borrowed time. By evening, the final piece of the story had clicked into place, passed from Silas to Jed, from Jed to the cowboys, and from the cowboys to the entire camp. Boaz McCall, hearing of Emmett's debts from Silas on a previous trip, had spent the last 2 weeks quietly and methodically buying every last one of them. He had sent a rider to Cheyenne to purchase the note on the land. He had paid Silas and 2 other merchants in full, transferring Emmett's credit markers into his own name. Every plank of wood in the cabin, every nail, every sack of beans, every bottle of whiskey legally. It all belonged to Boaz McCall. The news settled over the camp like a winter freeze. It was a move of breathtaking scope and quiet ruthlessness. This was not a fist fight in a saloon. This was a strategic dismantling of a man's entire existence, executed with the cold, legal precision of a chess master. Emmett knew. The terror of his situation had sobered him faster than a bucket of ice water. He was trapped. He paced the small cabin like a caged animal, his bluster and rage replaced by a sour, sweating fear. Eloise watched him, her own face pale with panic. Her clever machinations had led them not to triumph, but to absolute ruin. They were squatters in their own home, their lives now held in the palm of a man they had grievously insulted. The next day, just after the midday meal, he came. The entire settlement seemed to hold its breath. Work stopped. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer ceased. Miners looked up from their sluice boxes. Boaz McCall rode into the camp alone, his big gray gelding moving at that same unhurried walk. He looked neither left nor right, his calm gaze fixed on the burned cabin. He was not dressed for a fight. He wore his usual durable work clothes. In his hand, he carried a roll of papers tied with a leather thong. He dismounted in front of the cabin and tied his horse to the hitching post. He did not immediately approach the door. He stood there for a moment, a solid, immovable presence, and let the weight of his arrival settle. The cabin door creaked open. Emmett stepped out, blinking in the harsh sunlight. He tried to summon some of his old arrogance, but it was a pathetic, watery imitation. "McCall," he said, his voice cracking. "What business do you have here?" Boaz did not answer immediately. He walked slowly toward the porch, his boots making soft, deliberate sounds in the dust. He stopped at the foot of the single wooden step, forcing Emmett to look down at him. "Burn," Boaz said, his voice low and even, yet it carried across the silent camp. "I believe we have some accounts to settle." He held up the roll of papers. "These are legal documents, a deed of title for this parcel of land, transferred to my name in Cheyenne 2 days ago. And these," he continued, unrolling the papers to reveal several promissory notes, each bearing Emmett's crude signature, "are your outstanding debts to the various merchants who supply this territory. As you can see, I have purchased them in full." Emmett stared at the papers, his face a mottled canvas of disbelief and terror. He knew what they meant. He was a ruined man. "You can't," he stammered. "This is my place." "It was never your place, Emmett," Boaz said, his voice edged with a cold contempt. "You just lived here on the credit and good faith of other men, a faith you were not prepared to honor. According to the law, everything on this land, this cabin, the tools, the remaining supplies is now my property, to be held against the debt you owe me." Inside the cabin, Clara stood just out of sight, listening. She had been working, putting her shattered kitchen back in some semblance of order, when she heard Boaz's horse. Now she stood frozen, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Emmett's fear finally gave way to a desperate, impotent rage. "You did this because of her," he shrieked,
pointing a trembling finger toward the cabin. "Because of that worthless cook you want her. Is that it? You can have her, take her. She's nothing to me." Boaz's expression did not change, but a dangerous stillness settled over him. The air grew colder. He took one slow step up onto the porch, and, for the first time, he was looking down at Emmett. Emmett, the bully, the tyrant of his small, squalid kingdom, visibly shrank. "I have no interest in your transactions. Burn," Boaz said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Yet it was more menacing than any shout. He looked Emmett directly in the eye, and Emmett's gaze faltered and fell. "I am a man who believes in paying a fair price for things," Boaz continued, his voice steady and clear, intended not just for Emmett, but for every listening ear in the camp, and for the silent woman inside the cabin. "I don't take what doesn't belong to me." He paused, letting the words hang in the dead air. "But I paid a price so you would no longer have the right to cause harm." The statement was a judgment, delivered with the finality of a gavel's fall. It was not a boast. It was not a threat. It was a simple, profound declaration of fact. He had not bought Clara. He had bought her freedom. He had not used his strength to conquer, but to shield. He rolled the papers back up and tucked them into his belt. "You have until sundown tomorrow to gather your personal effects and be off this land," he said. "The wagon and 2 mules are yours to take. That is more than you deserve. If you are here when the sun sets, I will have you removed as a trespasser." He turned his back on the broken, stammering man, stepped off the porch, and walked to his horse. He untied the reins, swung himself into the saddle with an easy, fluid motion, and rode out of the camp without a backward glance. The settlement was silent for a long moment after he was gone. Then, slowly, the sounds of work resumed. But they were different now. A weight had been lifted. An abscess had been lanced. Emmett Barnes stood on the porch of the house that was no longer his, a man stripped of everything, not by force of arms, but by the simple, inexorable logic of his own failures. He was no longer a threat. He was just a pathetic, empty man. Inside, Clara leaned against the rough timber wall, her legs suddenly weak. She slid down to the floor, the splinters of her ruined world around her. He had paid a price. He had paid a price so that he would no longer have the right to cause harm. The words echoed in the silent, broken spaces of her heart. It was not the passionate declaration of a suitor. It was something far deeper, far more powerful. It was an act of justice. The cage door had been blown off its hinges, and she was left sitting in the sudden, terrifying, and brilliant light of freedom. The sun bled out across the horizon, leaving a raw, purple-red wound in its wake. Night fell not as a gentle blanket, but as a sudden, cold weight. The settlement grew quiet, the sounds of labor replaced by the nervous crackle of campfires and the low murmur of voices. No one looked toward the burned cabin, yet everyone was aware of it. It sat in the darkness like a tomb, a place where a man's life had ended long before he was dead. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of fury and the stench of stale whiskey. Emmett sat at the table, a hunched, broken shape in the flickering lamplight. He was no longer the raging tyrant. The fear had hollowed him out, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling shell of a man. He stared at his hands, the instruments of his petty reign, as if he no longer recognized them. They were useless now. The power they had held was an illusion, one that had been stripped away by a handful of legal papers and the calm, unwavering eyes of Boaz McCall. Eloise scurried about in the shadows, her movements quick and furtive as a mouse. She was packing, throwing their few meager possessions into a worn carpet bag. Every sound she made, every rustle of cloth, seemed to make Emmett flinch. Her world, too, had collapsed. Her schemes had amounted to this, a midnight eviction into a wilderness that had no place for a woman with soft hands and a cunning that was now useless. Her loyalty to Emmett, always a thing of convenience, had evaporated completely. She looked at him now not with affection or even pity, but with a cold, reptilian contempt for his weakness. And in the kitchen, Clara worked. She had spent the hours since Boaz's departure in a state of focused, almost trance-like activity. The ruin of her kitchen was the landscape of her soul, and she was methodically putting it back in order. She had righted the overturned tables and shelves. She had scrubbed the stew from the hearthstones. She had gathered the dented pots and pans, and with a heavy mallet from the tool shed, she began the laborious process of beating them back into shape. Each blow of the hammer was a punctuation mark in the cabin's suffocating silence. Clang, clang, clang. It was a sound of reclamation, a sound of remaking. She was not just fixing the pots, she was forging something new within herself. The fear was gone, burned away in the fire that had consumed her mother's recipes. The habit of endurance, of bending so as not to break, was shattered. She had nothing left to protect, nothing left to lose, and in that barren emptiness, she had found a strange and terrible strength. Emmett watched her. He lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes focusing on her silhouette against the firelight. He saw her working, her movements deliberate and sure. She was not weeping. She was not cowering. She was rebuilding. She was moving on, already erasing him from the space he had once commanded. And in his whiskey-soaked mind, this calm, purposeful activity was the final, unbearable insult. She was not behaving like a victim. She was behaving as if she had won. A dark, venomous sludge began to bubble up from the pit of his fear. It was the last, desperate rage of a dethroned king. "Sss, look at you," he slurred, his voice a low, ugly growl. "Like nothing happened, like you didn't bring this all down on us." Clara did not stop her work. She placed a dented saucepan on the anvil she had dragged in from the shed and struck it a sharp, ringing blow with the mallet. "It was you and him," Emmett went on, his voice rising as he fed his own fury. "You, with your fancy pies and your quiet little looks. You think you're better than everyone. You think you pulled one over on me." Clang! The sound of the hammer was her only reply. "He's not going to have you," Emmett snarled, pushing himself to his feet. The chair screeched back, and Eloise froze, her eyes wide with terror. "You think a man like McCall wants a broken-down cook? He just wanted to humiliate me. And you helped him. You let him." He stumbled toward the kitchen, his shadow looming large and monstrous on the wall. "I'm still the man of this house until sunup," he spat. "And you still owe me respect." He was inside her space now, his presence fouling the air she had just begun to cleanse. She stopped hammering. She placed the mallet down on the anvil with a soft, metallic click. She did not turn to face him. "You're going to look at me when I talk to you, girl," he growled. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the flesh above her elbow. It was the old gesture of dominance, the assertion of physical power that had always worked before. He spun her around to face him, his face contorted, ready to see the familiar terror in her eyes, the fear that had always been his due. But the fear was not there. Clara did not flinch. She did not cry out. She did not even try to pull away. She simply stood there, her body relaxed, and looked at him. Her eyes, once a haven of haunted sorrow, were now as calm and as cold as river stones in the dead of winter. There was nothing in them for him to grab onto. No fear to feed his rage, no pain to validate his power. There was only a vast, empty stillness that reflected his own ugly, pathetic soul right back at him. He faltered. His grip on her arm, meant to be a vice, felt weak and ineffectual. He was a man shouting into a canyon, and all that came back was the hollow echo of his own voice. He had expected to find the frightened girl he had tormented for years. Instead, he was facing a stranger, a woman made of something he could not break. The commotion, the sudden silence followed by Emmett's raised voice, had not gone unnoticed. The door of the cabin was slightly ajar, a futile attempt to let out the night's oppressive heat, drawn by the sound. A few of the cowboys had drifted over from their fire. They stood in the shadows just beyond the porch,
their faces grim, their presence a silent, collective witness. They were followed by others, miners and teamsters, forming a silent, watching crowd. Emmett became aware of them, of the eyes in the darkness. His rampage against her kitchen had been a private affair. This was public. His humiliation was being laid bare for all to see. He was holding onto the arm of a woman who was not afraid of him, while the world watched. And then Clara spoke. Her voice was not a scream or a plea. It was low, calm, and resonant, as clear and as cold as the mallet striking the anvil. It was a voice that had been forged in a fire hotter than any hearth, and it carried an authority that was absolute. "Get out of my house." The words were simple, but the meaning was a revolution. My house. It was a claim of ownership, of self, of a life that was no longer his to command. It was the voice of a free woman. Emmett stared at her, his mouth agape. He looked from her cold, unyielding eyes to the silent, judging faces in the darkness beyond the door. In that moment, he saw the totality of his defeat. He was nothing, a hollow man, a coward stripped of his power, exposed for all to see. The strength went out of his hand. His fingers, which had been digging into her arm, went slack. He let go. He took a staggering step back, then another, bumping into the wreckage of a chair. He was broken, not by Boaz McCall's money or his legal papers, but by the quiet, unshakable strength of the woman he had tried and failed to destroy. He turned, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed, and stumbled out of the kitchen. He did not look at the men watching him. He pushed past the silent crowd, a man walking through his own funeral procession. A moment later, Eloise, her face pale and pinched, scurried out after him, clutching her carpet bag, a rat deserting the ship. The crowd parted to let them pass, and then watched in silence as they faded into the darkness. Two pathetic ghosts banished from the world of the living. The cowboys and the miners lingered for a moment. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they turned and melted back into the night, leaving Clara alone. The silence that returned was different. It was not heavy and oppressive. It was clean. It was empty. It was hers. She stood in the center of her kitchen, the heart of her reclaimed world, and slowly, she lifted her hands into the faint lamplight. She looked at them. The left, with its crude splint and its ugly, healing bruises, a testament to the pain she had endured. The right, strong and capable, covered in the grime of her work, a symbol of the will that had brought her through. They were her hands. For the first time, they belonged to no one but herself, and in the profound, quiet stillness of her newfound freedom, she began, once more, to clean. The morning broke, clear and sharp. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Clara woke not to the sound of Emmett's guttural snores or the oppressive weight of his presence, but to the clean, vast silence of the prairie. The light that filtered through the greased paper window seemed different, less judgmental. It was just light. The air was just air. She was just a woman, alone in a quiet cabin. The simplicity of it was so profound it was terrifying. Freedom was a heavier burden than she had imagined. It was a vast, empty plain with no landmarks, no path to follow. For years, her life had been a narrow, brutal track, her every step dictated by the need to survive, to endure, to avoid the next blow. Now, the track was gone. There was only the horizon, and the terrifying, exhilarating choice of which direction to walk. She did not allow herself to be paralyzed by it. Her body, trained by years of habit, knew what to do even when her mind was reeling. She rose, built a fire in the hearth, and put the single pot of water on to boil for coffee. She moved through the wreckage of her kitchen, her feet finding sure paths through the debris. The space was a reflection of her inner state shattered, but not entirely destroyed. The foundations were still there. After she had her coffee, a bitter, black brew that seemed to match her mood, she began the real work. She did not start by cleaning. She started by remembering. She found a half-burned log from the fire, its end charred into a perfect piece of charcoal. For paper, she used the back of a discarded supply manifest she found in a corner, its neat columns of figures a stark contrast to the task she was about to undertake. She sat on the floor, the paper spread on her knees, and closed her eyes. She reached back, past the smoke and the fury of the night before, to a greener, gentler time. She summoned the image of her mother's hands, dusted with flour. She summoned the smell of her mother's kitchen, a warm, safe cloud of yeast and cinnamon and roasting meat. She summoned her mother's voice, a soft Irish lilt, whispering instructions, secrets passed down through generations. The secret to a good soda bread, Clara girl, is a light hand and a quick oven. Don't be bullying the dough. Her own hand, the one that held the charcoal, trembled. The first marks she made were clumsy, a child's scrawl, but she persisted. She wrote not with words, for she had few of them, but with measurements and symbols, a cup, a spoon, a pinch, a drawing of a round loaf, scored with a cross to let the fairies out. She was not just writing a recipe. She was resurrecting a ghost, coaxing it back to life with the force of her will and the clarity of her memory. Next came the recipe for the beef stew, the one that had been the catalyst for so much pain. She remembered the herbs, the precise moment to add the potatoes so they would be tender but not mushy, the secret of a splash of dark stout to give the gravy its rich, deep color. She wrote it all down, her charcoal stick scratching against the paper. Each word was an act of defiance. He had burned the paper, but he could not burn the memory. He had broken her hand, but he could not break the knowledge held within her. She worked for hours, her back aching, her stomach empty, but she did not stop. She was a scholar, a scribe, a historian of her own small, quiet life, reclaiming her sacred texts from the ashes. By the time the sun was high in the sky, she had filled the back of the manifest with the ghosts of a dozen recipes. It was a messy, chaotic document, but it was a beginning. It was proof that she still existed. Only then did she begin to rebuild the kitchen. She started with the pots. She took them one by one to the anvil and, with the heavy mallet, began the slow, rhythmic work of hammering them back into shape. It was loud, difficult labor, and her healing hand ached in protest, but she found a strange comfort in the ringing of the steel. Each dent she smoothed out felt like a wrinkle being erased from her own soul. She was not just repairing the tools of her trade, she was repairing herself, blow by blow. The community, which had held its collective breath during the confrontation, began to exhale. That afternoon, Jed, Boaz McCall's foreman, appeared at her door. He was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of hard years. He did not enter, but stood on the porch, his hat in his hands. "The men were wondering, ma'am," he said, his eyes fixed on a point just over her shoulder, "if you might be persuaded to continue cooking, for wages, of course, to be paid directly to you." It was a business proposition, but it was also a vote of confidence, an acknowledgement of her new status. She was no longer an appendage of Emmett Byrne. She was a free agent. "I will cook," she said, her voice still holding that new, metallic quietness. "The price will be fair." "That's all we ask, ma'am," Jed said, looking relieved. He nodded and left. The next morning, the first offering appeared. One of the miners, a quiet, solitary man named Silas, whom she had never spoken to, left a small, neatly tied bundle of freshly caught trout on her doorstep. There was no note. There were no words exchanged. It was a silent apology from the community for their years of passive witness. It was a gesture of peace. Others followed. A woman from a nearby homestead brought a basket of eggs. A cowboy left a haunch of venison. They were not giving her charity. They were bartering. They were re-establishing the ancient, honorable rhythm of trade, of a community looking after its own. They brought her the raw materials. and in return, she transformed them, through her skill and her fire, into sustenance and comfort. Trust, which had been a dead and withered thing, was beginning to send out new, tentative roots. She learned to adapt. Her left hand, while healing, was stiff and weak. She learned to use her right hand with an even greater dexterity. She learned to brace pots against her hip, to use the edge of the table as a second hand, to chop and stir with a fluid. One-handed grace born of necessity. Paradoxically, her cooking became better, more intentional. With her physical limitations, she could not afford a single wasted movement. Every action had to be precise, considered. She put more of herself into the food because the process demanded more from her. And Boaz came. He did not come for 2 days. She told herself she was glad. His presence was a complication, a question she did not have an answer for. But a small, traitorous part of her listened for the sound of his horse's hooves. He arrived on the 3rd day, near sundown. He did not ride to the cabin, but to the broken section of corral fence 50 yards away. He dismounted and began to work, testing the posts, measuring the rails. He was a man at work on his own land. He had a reason to be there. Clara watched him from her kitchen. She was baking bread, using the fine flour he had given her. The familiar, comforting smell filled the air. He worked for nearly an hour, his large frame moving with a quiet, powerful efficiency. Finally, as if just noticing the light from her fire, he walked toward the cabin. As always, he stopped at the threshold. He did not presume to enter. "Evening, ma'am," he said, taking off his hat. "Mr. McCall," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. She did not stop her work. "The fence needs mending," he said, gesturing with his head. "Rot in the posts. I'll be sending a couple of my men with new timber tomorrow." "That would be good," she said. An awkward silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire. He was looking at the kitchen, at the newly repaired pots hanging in neat rows, at the orderly shelves she had rebuilt. He saw the work she had done. "Looks like you've been busy," he said. "There was much to do. If you need lumber for the shelves, or anything else," he said, "just tell Jed. I'll see it's provided." He was talking about the house, about the structure, not about her. He was offering resources, not pity. He was treating her with the quiet respect of one landowner to another. "Thank you," she said. "I would be grateful for some new boards for the floor." "I'll see to it," he said. He paused, as if about to say something more, then seemed to think better of it. He just nodded, put on his hat, and walked back to his horse. His visits continued in this vein. They were never just for the sake of visiting. There was always a practical, tangible reason. He came to check on the new fence posts. He came with a team to re-roof the leaking stable. He came to discuss the water rights for the creek with his foreman. And each time, he would stop at her kitchen. He never stayed long. Their conversations were brief, circling around the practical matters of the land, the weather, the work. He would bring coffee, a new blend from a supplier in Cheyenne. She would offer him a cup, and they would drink it in a shared, comfortable silence on her porch. He never asked about Emmett. He never asked what her plans were. He never, in any way, alluded to the fact that he was her benefactor, her rescuer. By his actions, he made it clear that he saw her not as a woman he had saved, but as a woman who was saving herself, and he was simply a neighbor, mending his fences. One evening, after he had helped her brace a sagging beam in the lean-to, she offered him a piece of fresh cornbread, still warm from the oven. He took it, his large, calloused hand gentle as he accepted it from hers. "You've brought the heart back to this place," he said quietly, looking not at her, but at the warm, fire-lit kitchen behind her. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a slow, tentative thawing of a land that had been frozen for a very long time. The baker had returned. Yes, the kitchen was being rebuilt, but as she watched him ride away into the twilight, his back straight and strong in the saddle. She realized something else was being built here as well. Something quiet and sturdy. One respectful visit, one shared cup of coffee at a time. Summer bled into autumn, the season turning with the slow, deliberate grace of a page in a well-read book. The brutal, white-hot sun of the Wyoming plains relented, replaced by a lower, gentler light that painted the landscape in shades of old gold and worn leather. The wind, which had been a hot, dust-choked breath, now carried a crisp, clean chill, whispering of the coming cold and smelling of distant pine and dry earth. The settlement had found a new equilibrium, with Emmett and Eloise gone. A layer of sour tension had been stripped away, leaving a community that was quieter, more functional, and more honest. The rhythms of life were dictated by work, weather, and the ringing of Clara's meal bell. The cabin, once a cage, had become a home, her home. Her life was still one of hard work, but it was work of her own choosing. The long days were hers. The small profits from feeding the men were hers. The quiet evenings were hers. The splint was long gone from her left hand. It remained stiff, the fingers not as nimble as they once were, and a pale, puckered scar snaked across her wrist, a permanent reminder of the price of her defiance. But it was a working hand. It could grip and lift and hold. She had taught it, through painful, patient repetition, to be useful again. Boaz McCall's visits had become the steady, quiet heartbeat of her new life. The pretense of business had slowly, almost imperceptibly, faded away. He still brought things a new axe head, a sack of winter potatoes from his root cellar, a jar of his housekeeper's prized peach preserves, but the offerings were now clearly gifts between friends, not transactions. He came most evenings, after the day's work was done, and they would sit on the small porch he had rebuilt for her, drinking coffee as the stars began to prick the deep, velvet sky. They did not talk much. They were both people who had been shaped by a world that valued action over words. He would speak of his ranch, of a newborn calf, of the coming winter. She would speak of her kitchen, of a new bread recipe she was trying, of the wild herbs she had found by the creek. Their conversations were like a slow, meandering river, never rushing, content to follow the contours of their quiet lives. A comfortable, companionable silence was the bedrock of their burgeoning relationship. In a world of noise and bluster, they had found a rare peace in each other's quiet company. One evening, as the first true chill of autumn settled in the air, he arrived to find the cabin filled with a rich, savory aroma that was new and intriguing. The meal they shared was simple. As always, thick slices of her sourdough bread, a crock of sweet butter, and hot, black coffee. He ate with his usual deliberate appreciation, but he could see a new, quiet light in her eyes, a flicker of nervous pride she could not quite conceal. After the simple meal was cleared away, she did not immediately sit down. She went to the hearth, where a covered cast-iron pan was nestled in the warm embers. She lifted it out with a padded cloth, her movements sure and practiced. She placed it on the table between them and removed the lid. Inside was a golden-crusted, rustic tart. The pastry was imperfect, clearly shaped by a single, dominant hand, but it was beautiful. Wild mushrooms, dark and earthy, were nestled in a bed of creamy goat cheese, a recent gift from a neighboring homesteader, and sprinkled with the wild thyme Boaz himself had brought her weeks ago. The scent was intoxicating, a perfect distillation of the autumn prairie. She cut a slice and placed it on a tin plate before him. He looked at it, then at her. Her face was tense with a quiet, hopeful anticipation. He picked up his fork and took a bite. The pastry was flaky, rich with the flavor of the lard he had given her. The mushrooms were meaty and deep, the cheese tangy, the thyme a fragrant, resinous counterpoint. It was the most complex and delicious thing he had ever tasted. It was not just food. It was a story of resilience, of resourcefulness, of a community slowly re-knitting itself, of a woman creating something beautiful and new out of the wild. raw ingredients of her life. He ate the entire slice in his usual, thoughtful silence. When he was finished, he set down his fork and looked at her, his calm, steady eyes holding hers. "In all my years," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble, "I have never tasted anything quite like that. It tastes of this land, but it tastes of you." A faint blush colored her cheeks, the first he had ever seen. She looked down at her hands, which were resting on the rough-hewn table. "It is a new recipe," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The others, the old ones, they were gone." She paused, gathering her courage, and then looked up at him, her gaze direct and clear. The time for hiding was over. "I have rewritten them," she said, and her voice, though quiet, was filled with a strength that was as real and as solid as the stone of the hearth behind her. "From what I could remember, and I have made new ones." He burned the pages, but he could not burn the knowledge. She glanced down at her scarred left wrist. "Even with one hand, I will still cook." It was a declaration of her soul's survival. It was a testament to a spirit that could not be broken, a creativity that could not be extinguished. She was not just a survivor, she was a creator. The baker had returned, not as a ghost of her mother, but as herself, whole and new and stronger than before. A slow smile spread across Boaz McCall's face, transforming his usually stoic features. It reached his eyes, and the deep, abiding loneliness she had once seen there was replaced by a gentle, overwhelming warmth. The admiration in his gaze was so profound it was almost a physical touch. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. "I have known hard men and I have seen strong women. I have seen people break against this land, and I have seen them endure it. But you are the strongest person I have ever met." The words settled in the quiet air of the cabin, a profound and simple truth. They were the highest praise he could give, the most honest gift he could offer. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the fire crackling in the hearth, the vast, silent prairie dark and still outside. The years of pain and fear and loneliness in Clara's heart seemed to melt away, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that mirrored his gaze. He did not reach for her. He did not make a grand, passionate declaration. That was not his way. Instead, his eyes moved around the small, imperfect kitchen. He looked at the mended pots, the rough, rebuilt shelves, the floorboards that still needed replacing. He saw not a ruin, but a foundation. "This kitchen," he began, his voice soft. "It has a good, strong heart, but the bones are weak. It needs a new floor. The roof will not last another winter. The walls need to be chinked and plastered before the first snow." He was talking about wood and nails, about practical, earthly things, but they both knew he was talking about something more. He looked back at her, and his eyes held a question that was as deep and as vast as the Wyoming sky. He did not ask for her hand in marriage. He did not ask her for promises she was not yet ready to give. He asked for something simpler, and yet infinitely more profound. "Can I," he asked, his voice steady and sure, "build it with you?" It was not an offer to save her, to provide for her. It was an offer to be a partner, to join her in her world, on her terms, to take the foundation she had so bravely reclaimed and build a future upon it, together. The last of the ice around Clara's heart broke. The tears that had refused to come in her deepest grief now welled in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from a joy so pure and so unexpected it was almost painful. She did not speak. She did not need to. She simply nodded. A single, decisive movement. Then, she did something she had never done before. She reached across the table. She held out her hand to him. Not her strong, capable right hand, but her left. The scarred hand. The broken hand. The hand that told the story of her past. It was an offering of trust, an invitation into her whole, true self, scars and all. Boaz's large, calloused hand. The hand of a man who worked the land and built things to last, closed around hers. His grip was not crushing, but firm and warm and safe. He did not just take her hand, he accepted it and all the story that came with it. And in the quiet cabin, in the heart of the vast and indifferent wilderness, a home was truly, finally, built. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting that hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.